You've heard of the Cold War, the nuclear arms race, the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what if I told you that's just the surface of a much deeper, more complex struggle? What if I told you that beneath the grand speeches and public standoffs, there were secret wars fought in the shadows, silent battles waged through espionage, economic sabotage, and covert military operations? This is the untold story of the Cold War, a story not written in history books but whispered in classified files and hidden behind iron curtains. Imagine a world where two superpowers, each armed to the teeth with weapons capable of erasing humanity, stand on the brink of annihilation, yet never directly fire at each other. It was a war fought in the minds of men, in secret meetings, in jungles, deserts, and city streets. It was a war of ideologies, but even more, it was a war for survival, economic, political, and technological. Let's start with espionage. The spies, the ones who lived in a world of forged passports, dead drops, and coded messages. The Cold War was the golden age of intelligence, where organizations like the CIA and the KGB didn't just observe history, they shaped it. Double agents played deadly games, some defecting for freedom, others for greed, some merely pawns in a grander scheme. People like Oleg Penkovsky, the Soviet colonel who fed crucial intelligence to the West, risking everything. Or Aldrich Ames, a high-ranking CIA officer who sold secrets to the Soviets, sending American spies to their deaths. Trust was a currency, and betrayal its greatest weapon. But espionage was just one layer. The real battlefield stretched far beyond Washington and Moscow. The Cold War was not cold at all. It was fought in blood-soaked proxy wars across continents. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Korea. These were just the ones that made the headlines. But what about Angola? Nicaragua? The Congo? Nations that became chess pieces in a game where the players were never on the front lines. The Soviet Union backed leftist revolutions, while the United States funded counter-movements, often leading to brutal civil wars, leaving nations in ruins. And then there was economic warfare, the kind of battle fought without a single bullet, yet capable of toppling regimes. The United States used its vast financial power to impose sanctions, cripple economies, and fuel dissent within the Eastern Bloc. Meanwhile, the Soviets played their own game, funding movements that sought to destabilize capitalist governments. It was a battle of ideologies, but more importantly, it was a battle of endurance. Who could outlast the other? Who would make the first fatal misstep? But the Cold War wasn't just fought on Earth. It extended into the stars. The space race was more than just a quest for cosmic dominance. It was a statement. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, it wasn't just a satellite, it was a message. We are ahead. And when the United States put a man on the moon, it wasn't just about Neil Armstrong's small step. It was about proving superiority on a global stage. Yet behind these public victories were secret military projects, hidden failures, and technological theft that shaped the modern world. And let's not forget the war of the mind, propaganda. Hollywood, literature, radio broadcasts, every medium became a tool to control perception. The United States painted the Soviet Union as a land of oppression. The USSR depicted America as a corrupt capitalist machine. Even culture was a battlefield, with governments funding artists, filmmakers, and musicians to push ideological narratives. The enemy was not just across the ocean. The enemy was in your neighbor's living room, in your school, on your television screen. And yet, after decades of tension, the Cold War didn't end with a bang. It ended with an economic collapse, with revolutions within the Soviet sphere, with the quiet realization that one side could no longer keep up. But was that really the end? Or did the Cold War simply evolve, morphing into new forms? Cyber warfare, economic influence, political meddling. This is just the beginning, a war that may never have truly ended. There were moments when the Cold War wasn't just about ideologies or political posturing. It was personal. It was two spies staring each other down across a crowded street in Berlin, a whispered conversation in a smoky cafe, a flicker of fear in the eyes of a defector. It was a war where trust could be a death sentence, and paranoia was the only way to survive. Now, imagine you're a Soviet double agent. You've been feeding the Americans secrets, but one mistake, one misstep, and your life ends in a nameless grave. The KGB is always watching, always listening. The CIA, meanwhile, is playing its own deadly game, turning Soviet officials, bribing informants, and weaving an intricate web of deception. Take Oleg Gordievsky, for instance. A high-ranking KGB officer turned double agent for the British MI6. He walked a razor's edge for years, passing invaluable information to the West, all while pretending to be a loyal Soviet officer. The tension of his existence was unbearable. Every handshake, every meeting could be his last. When the KGB grew suspicious, he had to escape. Smuggled out of the Soviet Union in the trunk of a car, his heart pounding with every passing checkpoint. The intelligence war was fought not just with men like Gordievsky, but with technology. Hidden cameras and cufflinks, microdots carrying state secrets, satellite imagery so detailed it could read a license plate from orbit. The US and the USSR were locked in a battle of innovation, constantly outmaneuvering each other. The Soviets, for instance, had their own successes, cracking the CIA's methods, infiltrating American intelligence, planting moles in places no one expected. Aldrich Ames, a name that would go down in history as one of the most devastating betrayals in American intelligence. A man who sold secrets to the KGB, costing the lives of countless CIA assets within the Soviet Union. The money he received? Over $2 million. The cost? Incalculable. His arrest in 1994 was a stark reminder that the Cold War's shadows stretched far beyond the Iron Curtain. And then there were the moments where the Cold War came terrifyingly close to becoming very, very hot. The Cuban Missile Crisis. A standoff between two nuclear-armed giants that nearly plunged the world into chaos. Missiles in Cuba, American warships in the Atlantic, Soviet submarines lurking beneath the waves. The world held its breath, and one Soviet submarine, B-59, found itself in the crosshairs of an American naval blockade. The US dropped depth charges, warning shots, but to the Soviet sailors, it felt like an attack. Inside the submarine, a decision had to be made. Fire their nuclear torpedo or surface and risk capture. One officer, Vasily Arkhipov, held the fate of the world in his hands. He refused to launch. His decision likely prevented a full-scale nuclear war. It was a game of nerves, a world where the smallest choices could mean survival or annihilation. A war fought with codes and whispers, with spies and counter-spies, with weapons that could never be used but always had to be ready. The Cold War wasn't just a clash of governments or spies. It was a war fought with ideas, with culture, with narratives spun so tightly that truth itself became a weapon. Propaganda was the silent soldier, infiltrating homes, minds, and generations. The Soviet Union had mastered the art of controlled information. Pravda, the state-run newspaper, shaped the daily thoughts of millions, dictating not just what people knew, but what they were allowed to believe. The KGB controlled what information leaked out, and more importantly, what was kept buried. Dissenting voices were silenced, rewritten, erased. Some disappeared into the labor camps of Siberia, their names whispered only in hushed defiance. But the West had its own arsenal: cinema, music, literature. The CIA funneled money into cultural programs, funding artists, musicians, and writers who promoted the values of freedom and democracy. Even George Orwell's Animal Farm was turned into an animated film with US backing, its anti-totalitarian message sharpened for mass consumption. Jazz music, banned in the Soviet Union for its corrupting influence, became a symbol of freedom, smuggled across borders on bootleg records, played in underground clubs where the spirit of resistance thrived. And then there was the media war. Operation Mockingbird, an effort by the CIA to infiltrate and influence Western journalism. Hundreds of journalists, some knowingly, some unknowingly, spread messages aligned with US intelligence goals. News stories were planted, headlines were manipulated, narratives crafted. If the Soviets controlled the press with an iron fist, the Americans used a velvet glove, shaping public perception with whispers instead of commands. But the Soviets had their own game plan. KGB defector Yuri Bezmenov warned of a slow, creeping ideological war. The goal? To destabilize Western societies from within, through disinformation campaigns, through fostering division, through eroding trust in institutions. Active measures, a doctrine of deception, misdirection, and subversion. Fake letters, false reports, forged documents planted to create chaos. The KGB spread rumors of US atrocities, of Western plots against developing nations, of sinister government experiments. Some of these lies were so well crafted that they lived on for decades, blurring the line between fiction and reality. And then there were the social movements, some organic and necessary, others nudged along by forces unseen. Both sides played this game, exploiting existing tensions, funding groups that could shift the political landscape. Some civil rights activists unknowingly received Soviet funding. Some anti-communist movements were propped up with CIA money. It was a war where the battlefield was the human mind, and the casualties were often the truth itself. This was a war where reality itself was a pawn, where ideas were more powerful than bullets, where a single photograph, a single phrase, a single song could shape the course of history. And in the end, when the Berlin Wall crumbled and the Soviet Union collapsed, the war of propaganda did not end. It merely evolved. The Cold War was not just fought on the battlefield, in dark alleys, or through whispers in embassies. It was fought in laboratories, in underground research facilities, in the race for technological dominance. It was a war of innovation, where physics, biology, and engineering became the new front lines. The space race, a battle not just for cosmic exploration, but for strategic superiority. Sputnik, the first satellite, shocked the world when it beeped its way into orbit in 1957. The Americans panicked. If the Soviets could send a satellite into space, what else could they do? The answer came in the form of intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear warheads that could be delivered across oceans in mere minutes. The sky was no longer a limit. It was a battlefield. Both sides pursued projects that bordered on science fiction. The United States explored building missile bases under the Arctic ice, known as Project Iceworm. The Soviets tested mind control experiments, attempting to manipulate thought through electromagnetic waves. The CIA had its own bizarre operations, from LSD-fueled mind experiments in MK Ultra to psychic espionage in Stargate Project. Some of these programs were absurd, others disturbingly real. But the most profound battlefield was one invisible to the naked eye: computation. The Cold War fueled the development of the modern computer, encryption techniques, and artificial intelligence research. The US and the Soviet Union raced to crack each other's codes, building ever more powerful machines to process intelligence faster than their adversaries. ARPANET, the precursor to the internet, was born from this era of paranoia and innovation. Underwater espionage. The US Navy tapped Soviet communication lines under the sea, listening in on secret military transmissions. Soviet submarines prowled the depths, equipped with nuclear warheads capable of launching a strike from anywhere in the world. The oceans became a silent theater of war, where a single mistake could lead to catastrophe. Perhaps the most terrifying moment of the Cold War came in 1983. A Soviet early warning system detected an incoming US missile strike. Alarms blared. The Soviet officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, had seconds to decide: launch a counterattack or hold. The fate of the world rested on his shoulders. He hesitated. His instincts told him it was a false alarm. He was right. If he had chosen differently, civilization might have ended that day. This was a war where knowledge was the greatest weapon, where science, innovation, and intelligence determined the balance of power. And though the Cold War officially ended, the technologies it birthed remain with us, shaping the world in ways we may never fully understand. The Cold War wasn't just about nuclear weapons, spies, and propaganda. It was also fought in boardrooms, oil fields, and currency exchanges. It was a war of economies, one that ultimately determined the fate of the Soviet Union. The United States and its allies understood that a prolonged arms race could bleed the Soviet economy dry. While the Soviet Union poured resources into maintaining military superiority, the West manipulated global markets, using financial tools as weapons. The strategy was clear: force the USSR into an economic death spiral. One of the most effective tools? Oil prices. The Soviet economy was heavily reliant on oil exports. In the 1980s, the United States struck a deal with Saudi Arabia to increase oil production, flooding the market and causing prices to plummet. The result? The Soviet Union, unable to sustain its budget, faced an economic crisis it could not recover from. But the problems ran deeper than oil. The rigid structure of the Soviet economy, centralized, inefficient, and burdened by bureaucracy, could not compete with the flexibility of capitalist markets. Shortages of basic goods became commonplace. Corruption flourished. The black market thrived as citizens sought goods the government could no longer provide. And then, there were strategic military feints designed to keep the Soviets spending. Operation Able Archer, A NATO exercise that simulated a nuclear attack pushed Soviet paranoia to the limit. Believing an actual strike might be imminent, the USSR ramped up military spending, diverting resources from an already strained economy. And then came the final push. In the late 1980s, US policies such as the Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars, forced the Soviet Union into an impossible position. The idea of an impenetrable missile defense system, even if not yet viable, was enough to make the USSR commit to countermeasures it simply could not afford. By 1991, the cracks had widened into fractures. Protests erupted across the Eastern Bloc. Former Soviet republics sought independence. The Iron Curtain, once thought indestructible, crumbled. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Cold War was over. But was it truly the end? Or had the battle merely changed forms? The Cold War may have officially ended, but its economic and political shadows still linger in the modern world. The fall of the Soviet Union marked the official end of the Cold War. But was it really over? Or did it simply take on new forms, covert, digital, economic, and psychological? The world did not suddenly become peaceful. Instead, the shadows stretched further, and the players adapted. Enter the era of cyber warfare. If the Cold War was once fought with spies and trench coats, today it is waged through ones and zeros. Espionage has gone digital. State-sponsored hacking groups from Russia, China, and the United States now conduct operations that would make Cold War intelligence agencies envious. Data breaches, ransomware attacks, and infrastructure disruptions have replaced traditional sabotage. Governments don't need spies sneaking into enemy embassies when they can infiltrate networks from thousands of miles away. Economic warfare never stopped either. The Cold War's financial battles laid the groundwork for a modern struggle fought through sanctions, trade wars, and resource control. The United States and its allies use economic pressure to weaken adversaries, freezing assets, cutting off access to global markets, and leveraging financial institutions. The echoes of Cold War strategies are seen in modern conflicts, as nations attempt to outmaneuver each other without firing a single shot. And then there's propaganda. The media war of the Cold War has transformed into a disinformation war. Social media, weaponized narratives, deepfake technology, governments no longer just control information, they distort reality itself. Fake news spreads faster than facts, polarizing societies, creating distrust, and weakening democracies from within. Psychological operations, once limited to radio broadcasts and leaflets, now play out in real time across the digital world. The Cold War may have officially ended in 1991, but its strategies, its tensions, and its battles never truly vanished. They transformed. They adapted. They became part of the New World Order. And as long as nations vie for power, as long as control remains the ultimate currency, the spirit of the Cold War will never truly die. This is not just history. This is now. The Cold War never ended. It simply changed its name. For decades, the world lived in fear. Fear of the bomb, fear of spies, fear of a war that could end civilization in mere minutes. The Cold War shaped everything. The way nations governed, the way economies functioned, the way people thought. And though it officially ended, its legacy remains deeply ingrained in our modern world. To some, it was a time of great patriotism. To others, it was a nightmare of paranoia and oppression. Leaders came and went, policies shifted, but the underlying tensions never fully dissolved. The chess game of power continued, just under different rules. The fall of the Soviet Union may have ended the Cold War on paper, but the world remained divided, its battlefields shifting from visible to invisible, from overt to covert. The question remains, did the Cold War ever truly end, or did it simply change its face? The ideological battle between authoritarianism and democracy persists. The balance of power continues to shift. New alliances form, and old rivalries simmer beneath the surface. The tools of war have changed, but the goals remain the same: control, influence, and survival. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Cold War is not in the battles that were fought, but in the wars that never happened. The world came to the brink of destruction multiple times: Cuba, Berlin, Korea, Vietnam, the nuclear standoffs. Yet restraint, diplomacy, and sometimes sheer luck pulled humanity back from the edge. It was a war that taught us the true cost of power, the fragility of peace, and the importance of vigilance. It lives on in the policies of nations, in the fears of societies, in the ambitions of leaders. It is embedded in the world order that exists today. And as history has shown us time and time again, while the players may change, the game never truly ends. This has been the untold story of the Cold War. A war fought in the shadows. A war that reshaped the world. A war that in many ways never truly ended.